Chapter 10 of The Lucky Piece, A Tale of the North Woods by Albert Bigelow Paine. Recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10 The Hermit's Story. The hermit paused and gazed into the bed of coals on the hearth. His listeners waited without speaking. Constance did not move, scarcely did she breathe. "As I said, it may have been 30 years ago," the gentle voice continued. "It may have been more than that. I do not know. It was on the Sound shore, in one of the pretty villages there. It does not matter which. I lived with my uncle in the adjoining village. Both my parents were dead. He was my guardian. In the winter, when the snow fell, there was merrymaking between these villages. We drove back and forth in sleighs, and there were nights along the Sound when the moon path followed on the water and the snow, and all the hills were white, and the bells jingled, and hearts were gay and young. It was on such a night that I met her who was to become Robin's mother. The gathering was in our village that night, and being very young, she had come as one of a merry sleighful. Halfway to our village their sleigh had broken down, and the merrymakers had gaily walked the remainder, trusting to our hospitality to return them to their homes. I was one of those to welcome them and to promise conveyance, and so it was that I met her, and from that moment there was nothing in all the world for me but her." The hermit lifted his eyes from the fire and looked at Constance. "My girl," he said, "there are turns in your face and tones of your voice that carry me back to that night. But Robin, when he first came here to my door, a stripling, he was her very self. I recall nothing of that first meeting but her. I saw nothing but her. I think we danced, we may have played games, it did not matter. There was nothing for me but her face. When it was over, I took her in my cutter and we drove together across the snow, along the moonlit shore. I do not remember what we said, but I think it was very little. There was no need. When I parted from her that night the heritage of eternity was ours. The law that binds the universe was our law, and the morning stars sang together as I drove homeward across the hills. That winter and no more holds my happiness. Yet if all eternity holds no more for me than that, still have I been blessed as few have been blessed, and if I have paid the price and still must pay, then will I pay with gladness, feeling only that the price of heaven is still too small, and eternity not too long for my gratitude." The hermit's voice had fallen quite to a whisper, and he was as one who muses aloud upon a scene rehearsed times innumerable. Yet in the stillness of that dim room every syllable was distinct, and his listeners waited, breathless, at each pause for him to continue. Into Frank's eyes had come the far-away look of one who follows in fancy an old tale, but the eyes of Constance shone with an eager light, and her face was tense and white against the darkness. "It was only that winter. When the spring came and the wild apple was in bloom, and my veins were all a tingle with new joy, I went one day to tell her father of our love. Oh, I was not afraid. I have read of trembling lovers and halting words. For me the moments were laggingly until he came, and then I overflowed like any other brook that breaks its dam in spring. And he listened, saying not a single word, but as I talked his eyes fell, and I saw tears gather under his lids. Then at last they rolled down his cheeks, and he bowed his head and wept. And then I did not speak further, but waited, while a dread that was cold like death grew slowly upon me. When he lifted his head, he came and sat by me and took my hand. "My boy," he said, "your father was my friend. I held his hand when he died, and a year later I followed your mother to her grave. You were then a little blue-eyed fellow, and my heart was wrung for you. It was not that you lacked friends or means, for there were enough of both. But, oh, my boy, there was another heritage. Have they not told you? Have you never learned that both your parents were stricken in their youth by that scourge of this coast, that fever which sets a foolish glow upon the cheek while it lays waste the life below and fills the land with early graves? Oh, my lad, you do not want my little girl." The hermit's voice died, and he seems almost to forget his listeners. But all at once he fixed his eyes on Constance as if he would burn her through. "Child," he said, "as you look now, so she looked in the moment of our parting. Her eyes were like yours, and her face, God help me, as I saw it through the dark that last night, was as your face is now. Then I went away. I do not remember all the places, but they were in many lands, and were such places as men seek who carry my curse. I never wrote. I never saw her, face to face, again. When I returned her father was dead, and she was married to a good man, they told me, and there was a child that bore my name, Robin, for I had been called Robin Gray. And then there came a time when a stress was upon the land, when fortunes tottered and men walked the streets with unseeing eyes, when his wealth and then hers vanished like smoke in the wind, when my own patrimony became but worthless paper, a mockery of scrolled engravings and gaudy seals. To me it did not matter. Nothing matters to one doomed. To them it was shipwreck. John Farnham, a high-strung, impetuous man, was struck down. The tension of those weeks, and the final blow, broke his spirit and undermined his strength. They had only a pittance and a little cottage in these mountains, which they had used as a camp for summer-time. It stood then where it stands today, on the North Elba road, in view of this mountain top. There they came in the hope that Robin's father might regain health to renew the fight. There they remained, for the father had lost courage and only found a little health by tilling the few acres of ground about the cottage. There, that year, a second child, a little girl, was born. It had grown very still in the hermitage. There was only a drip of the rain outside. The thunder had rolled away. The voice, too, ceased for a little, as if from weariness. The others made no sign, but it seemed to Frank that the hand locked closely in his hand had become quite cold. "The word of those things drifted to me," so the tale went on, "and it made me sad that with my own depleted fortune and failing health I could do nothing for their comfort or relief. But one day my physician said to me that the air and the altitude of these mountains had been found beneficial for those stricken like me. He could not know how his words made my heart beat. Now, indeed, there was a reason for my coming, an excuse for being near her, with a chance of seeing her, it might be, though without her knowledge. For I decided that she must not know. Already she had enough burden without the thought that I was near, without the sight of my doleful, wasting features. So I sold the few belongings that were still mine, such things as I had gathered in my wanderings, my books, save those I loved most dearly, my furnishings, my ornaments, even to my apparel, and with the money I bought the necessities of mountain life, implements, rough wear, and a store of food. These, with a tent, my gun, the few remaining volumes, and my field glass, the companion of all my travels, I brought to the hills. He pointed to the glass and the volumes lying on the stone at his hand. "Those have been my life," he went on. "The books have brought me a world wherein there was ever a goodly company, suited to my mood. For me, in that world, there are no disappointments nor unfilled dreams. King, lover, courtier, and clown, how often at my bidding have they trooped out of the shadows to gather with me about this hearth. Oh, I should have been poor indeed without the books. Yet the glass has been to me even more, for it brought me her. I have already told you that their cottage could be seen from this mountain top. I learned this when I came stealthily to the hills and sought out their home, and some spot amid the overhanging peaks where I might pitch my camp, and there, unseen, look down upon her life. This is the place I found. I had my traps borne up the trail to the foot of the little fall, as if I would camp there. Then, when the guides were gone, I carried them here, and reared my small establishment, away from the track of hunters, on this high finger of rock which commanded the valley and her home. There is a spring here, and a little bit of fertile land. It was state land, and free, and I pitched my tent here, and that summer I cleared an open space for tillage, and built a hut for the winter. The sturdy labor and the air of the hills strengthened my arm and renewed my life. But there was more than that. For often there came a clear day when the air was like crystal and other peaks drew so near that it seemed one might reach out and stroke them with his hand. On such a day, with my glass, I sought a near-by point where the mountain's elbow jutted out into the sky, and when from that high vantage I gazed down on the roof which covered her, my soul was filled with the strength to tarry on. For distance became as nothing to my magic glass. 3 miles it may be as the crow flies, but I could bring the tiny cottage and the dooryard, as it stood there at the turn of the road above the little hill, so close to me that it seemed to lie almost at my very feet. Again the speaker rested for a moment, but presently the tale went on. You can never know what I felt when I first saw her. I had watched for her often, and I think she had been ill. I had seen him come and go, and sometimes I had seen a child, Robin it was, playing about the yard. But one day when I had gone to my point of lookout and had directed my glass, there, just before me, she stood. There she lived and moved, she who had been, who was still my life, who had filled my being with a love that made me surrender her to another, yet had lured me at last to this lonely spot, forever away from men, only that I might now and again gaze down across the tree-tops, and all unseen, unknown to her, make her the companion of my hermit life. She walked slowly, and the child walked with her, holding her hand. When presently she looked toward me, I started and shrank, forgetting for the moment that she could not see me. Not that I could distinguish her features at such a range, only her dear outline, but in my mind's eye her face was there before me, just as I have seen yours in the firelight. He turned to Constance, whose features had become blurred in the shadows. Frank felt her tremble and caught the sound of a repressed sob. He knew that tears were streaming down her cheeks, and his own eyes were not dry. After that I saw her often, and sometimes the infant, Robin's sister, was in her arms. When the autumn came and the hills were glorified and crowned with snow, she stood many times in the dooryard to behold their wonder. When at last the leaves fell and the trees were bare, I could watch even from the door of my little hut. The winter was long. The winter is always long up here, from November almost till May, but it did not seem long to me, when she was brought there to my door, even though I might not speak to her. And so I lived my life with her. The life in that cottage became my life, day by day, week by week, year by year, and she never knew. After that first summer I never but once left the mountain top. All my wants I supplied here. There was much game of every sort, and the fish near by were plentiful. I had a store of meal for the first winter, and during the next summer I cultivated my bit of cleared ground, and produced my full need of grain and vegetables and condiments. One trip I made to a distant village for seeds, and from that day never left the mountain again. It was during the 5th winter, I think, after I came here, that a group of neighbors gathered in the dooryard of the cottage, and my heart stood still, for I feared that she was dead. The air dazzled that day, but when near evening I saw a woman with a hand to each child re-enter the little house, I knew that she still lived, and had been left alone. Oh, then my heart went out to her. Day and night I battled with the impulse to go to her, with love and such comfort and protection as I could give. Time and again I rose and made ready for the journey to her door. Then, oh then, I would remember that I had nothing to offer her, nothing but my love. Penniless and a dying man, likely to become a helpless burden at any time, what could I bring to her but added grief? And perhaps in her unconscious heart she knew. For more than once that winter, when the trees were stripped and the snow was on the hills, I saw her gaze long and long toward this mountain, as if she saw the speck my cabin made, and once when I stretched my arms out to her across the waste of deadly cold, I saw a moment later that her arms too were outstretched, as if somehow she knew that I was there. A low moan interrupted the tale. It was from Constance. "Don't, oh, don't!" she sobbed. "You break my heart." But a moment later she added brokenly, "Yes, yes, tell me the rest. Tell me all. Oh, she was so lonely. Why did you never go to her?" "I would have gone then. I went mad and cried out, 'My wife, my wife, I want my wife!' And I would have rushed down into the drifts of the mountain. But in that moment the curse of my heritage fell heavily upon me and left me powerless." The hermit's voice had risen. It trembled and died away with the final words. In the light of the fading embers only his outline could be seen, wandering into the dusk and silence. When he spoke again his tone was low and even. "And so the years went by. I saw the sturdy lad toil with his mother for a while, and then alone, and I knew by her slow step that the world was slipping from her grasp. I did not see the end. I might have gone then, but it came at a time when the gloom hung in the mountains, and I did not know. When the air cleared and for days I saw no life, I knew that the little house was empty, that she had followed him to rest. They two, whose birthright had been health and length of days, both were gone, while I, who came from the cradle had made death my bedfellow, still lingered and still linger through the years. I put the magic glass aside after that for my books. Nothing was left me but my daily round, with them for company. Yet from a single volume I have peopled all the woods about, and every corner of my habitation. Through this forest of Arden, I have walked with Orlando, and with him hung madrigals on the trees, half believing that Rosalind might find them. With Nick the weaver on a moonlit bank I have waited for Titania and Puck and all that lightsome crew. On the wild mountain top I have met Lear, wandering with only a fool for company, and I have led them in from the storm and warned them at this hearthstone. In that recess Romeo has died with Juliet in the Capulets' tomb. With me at that table Jack Falstaff and Prince Hal have crossed their wit and played each the role of king. Yonder, beneath the dim eaves, in the moment just before you came, Macbeth had murdered Duncan, and I saw him cravenly vanish at the sound of your fearsome knocking. But what should all this be to you? It is but my shadow world, the only world I had until one day, out of the mist as you have come, so Robin came to me, her very self, it seemed, from heaven. At first it lay in my heart to tell him, but the fear of losing him held me back, as I have said. And of himself he told me as little. Rarely he referred to the past. Only once, when I spoke of kindred, he said that he was an orphan, with only a sister, who had found a home with kind people in a distant land. And with this I was content, for I had wondered much concerning the little girl. The voice died away. The fire had become ashes on the hearth. The drip of the rain had ceased. Light found its way through the parchment-covered window. The storm had passed. The hermit's story was ended. Neither Constance nor Frank found words, and for a time their host seemed to have forgotten their presence. Then, arousing, he said, "You will wish to be going now. I have detained you too long with my sad tale. But I have always hungered to pour it into some human ear before I died. Being young, you will quickly forget and be merry again, and it has lifted a heaviness from my spirit. I think we shall find the sun on the hills once more, and I will direct you to the trail. But perhaps you will wish to pause a moment to see something of my means of providing for life in this retreat. I will ask of you, as I did of Robin, to say nothing of my existence here to the people of the world. Yet you may convey to Robin that you have been here, saying no more than that. And you may say that I would see him when next he builds his campfire not far away, for my heart of hearts grows hungry for his face." Rising, he led them to the adjoining room. "This was my first hut," he said. "It is now my storehouse, where, like the squirrels, I gather for the winter. I hoard my grain here, and there is a pit below where I keep my other stores from freezing. There in the corner is my mill, the wooden mortar and pestle of our forefathers, and here you see I have provided for my water supply from the spring. Furs have renewed my clothing, and I have never wanted for sustenance, chiefly nuts, fruits, and vegetables. I no longer kill the animals, but have made them my intimate friends. The mountains have furnished me with everything, companions, shelter, clothing, and food, savors, even salt, for just above a deer lick I found a small trickle from which I have evaporated my supply. Year by year I have added to my house, making it, as you have seen, a part of the forest itself, that it might be less discoverable, though chiefly because I love to build somewhat as the wild creatures build, to know the intimate companionship of the living trees, and to be with the birds and squirrels as one of their household." They passed out into the open air, and to a little plot of cultivated ground shut in by the thick forest. It was an orderly garden, with well-kept paths, and walks of old-fashioned posies. Bright and fresh after the summer rain, it was like a gay jewel, set there on the high mountainside, close to the bending sky. It was near sunset, and a chorus of birds were shouting in the tree tops. Coming from the dim cabin, with its faded fire and its story of human sorrow, into this bright living place, was stepping from enchantment of the play into the daylight of reality. Frank praised the various wonders in a subdued voice, while Constance found it difficult to speak at all. Presently, when they were ready to go, the hermit brought the basket and the large trout. "You must take so fine a prize home," he said. "I do not care for it." Then he looked steadily at Constance, and added, "The likeness to her I loved eludes me by daylight. It must have been a part of my shadows and my dreams." Constance lifted her eyes tremblingly to the thin, fine, weather-beaten face before her. In spite of the ravage of years and illness she saw, beneath it all, the youth of long ago, and she realized what he had suffered. "I thank you for what you have told us to-day," she said, almost inaudibly. "It shall be, it is, very sacred to me." "And to me," echoed Frank, holding out his hand. He led them down the steep hillside by a hidden way to the point where the trail crossed the upper brook, just below the fall. "I have sometimes lain concealed here," he said, "and heard mountain climbers go by. Perhaps I caught a glimpse of them. I suppose it is the natural hunger one has now and then for his own kind." A moment later he had grasped their hands, bidden them a fervent godspeed, and disappeared into the bushes. The sun was already dipping behind the mountain tops, and they did not linger, but rapidly and almost in silence made their way down the mountain. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of The Lucky Piece, A Tale of the North Woods, by Albert Bigelow Paine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. During the Absence of Constance. Yet the adventure on the mountain was not without its ill effects. It happened that day that Mr. and Mrs. Deane had taken one of their rare walks over to Spruce Lodge. They had arrived early after luncheon, and learning that Frank and Constance had not been seen there during the morning, Mrs. Deane had immediately assured herself that dire misfortune had befallen the absent ones. The possibility of their having missed their way was the most temperate of her conclusions. She had visions of them lying maimed and dying at the foot of some fearful precipice. She pictured them being assailed by wild beasts. She imagined them tasting of some strange mushroom and instantly falling dead as a result. Fortunately, the guide who had seen Frank set out alone was absent. Had the good lady realized that Constance might be alone in a forest growing dark with a coming storm, her condition might have become even more serious. As it was, the storm came down and held the Deanes at the lodge for the afternoon, during which period Mr. Deane, who was not seriously disturbed by the absence of the young people, endeavored to convince his wife that it was more than likely they had gone directly to the camp and would be there when the storm was over. The nervous mother was far from reassured, and was for setting out immediately through the rain to see. It became a trying afternoon for her comforters, and the lugubrious croaking of the small woman in black and the unflagging optimism of Miss Carroway, as the two wandered from group to group throughout the premises, gave the episode a general importance of which it was just as well that the wanderers did not know. Yet the storm proved an obliging one to Frank and Constance, for the sun was on the mountain long before the rain had ceased below, and as they made straight for the Deane camp, they arrived almost as soon as Mrs. Deane herself, who, bundled in waterproofs, and supported by her husband and an obliging mountain climber, had insisted on setting out the moment the rain ceased. It was a cruel blow not to find the missing ones at the moment of arrival, and even their prompt appearance, in full health and with no tale of misfortune, but only the big trout and a carefully prepared story of being confused in the fog, but safely sheltered in the forest, did not fully restore her. She was really ill next day, and carried Constance off for a week to Lake Placid, where she could have medical attention close at hand and keep her daughter always in sight. It began by being a lonely week for Frank, for he had been commanded by Constance not to come to Lake Placid, and to content himself with sending occasional brief letters, little more than news bulletins, in fact. Yet presently he became less forlorn. He went about with a preoccupied look that discouraged the attentions of Miss Carroway. For the most part, he spent his mornings at the Lodge, in his room. Immediately after luncheon he usually went for an extended walk in the forest, sometimes bringing up at the Deane camp, where perhaps he dined with Mr. Deane, a congenial spirit, and remained for a game of cribbage, the elder man's favorite diversion. Once Frank set out to visit the hermitage, but thought better of his purpose, deciding that Constance might wish to accompany him there on her return. One afternoon he spent following a trout brook, and returned with a fine creel of fish, though none so large as the monster of that first day. Robin Farnham was absent almost continuously during this period, and Edith Morrison Frank seldom saw, for the last weeks in August brought the height of the season, and the girl's duties were many and imperative. There came no opportunity for the talk he had meant to have with her, and as she appeared always pleasant of manner, only a little thoughtful, and this seemed natural with her responsibilities, he believed that, like himself, she had arrived at a happier frame of mind. And certainly the young man was changed. There was a new light in his eyes, and it somehow spoke a renewed purpose in his heart. Even his step and carriage were different. When he went swinging through the forest alone, it was with his head thrown back, and sometimes with his arms outspread he whistled and sang to the marvelous greenery above and about him. And he could sing. Perhaps his was not a voice that would win fame or fortune for its possessor, but there was in it a note of ecstasy which answered back to the call of the birds, to the shout or moan of the wind, to every note of the forest. That was, in fact, a tone in the deep chord of nature, a lilt in the harmony of the universe. He forgot that his soul had ever been asleep. A sort of child frenzy for the mountains, such as Constance had echoed to him that wild day in March, grew upon him and possessed him, and he did not pause to remember that it ever had been otherwise. When the storm came down from the peaks, he strode out into it, and shouted his joy in its companionship, and raced with the wind, and threw himself face down in the wet leaves to smell the ground. And was it no more than the happiness of a lover who believes himself beloved that had wrought this change, or was there in this renewal of the mind joy of living the reopening and the flow of some deep and half-forgotten spring? From that day on the mountain he had not been the same. That morning with its new resolve, the following of the brook which had led him back to boyhood, the capture of the great trout, the battle with the mountain and the mist, the meeting with Constance at the top, the hermit's cabin with its story of self-denial and abnegation, Its life so close to the very heart of nature, so far from idle pleasure and luxury, with that eventful day had come the change. In his letters to Constance, Frank did not speak of these things. He wrote of his walks, it is true, and he told her of his days fishing, also of his visits to her father at the camp. But of any change or regeneration in himself, any renewal of old dreams and effort, he spoke not at all. The week lengthened before Constance returned, though it was clear from her letters that she was disinclined to linger at a big conventional hotel when so much of the summer was slipping away in her beloved forest. From day to day they had expected to leave, she wrote, but as Mrs. Dean had persuaded herself that the Lake Placid practitioner had acquired some new and subtle understanding of nerve disorders, they were loath to hurry. The young lady ventured a suggestion that Mr. Weatherby was taking vast comfort in his freedom from the duties and responsibilities of accompanying a mushroom enthusiast in her daily rambles, especially a very exacting young person with a predilection for trying new kinds upon him and for seeking strange and semi-mythical specimens, peculiar to hazy and lofty altitudes. "I am really afraid I shall have to restrain my enthusiasm," she wrote in one of these letters. "I am almost certain that Mamma's improvement and desire to linger here are largely due to her conviction that so long as I am here you are safe from the baleful Amanita, not to mention myself. Besides, it is a little risky sometimes, and one has to know a very great deal to be certain. I have had a lot of time to study the book here, and have attended a few lectures on the subject. Among other things, I have learned that certain amanitas are not poison, even when they have the cup. One in particular that I thought deadly is not only harmless, but a delicacy which the Romans called Caesar's mushroom, and of which one old epicure wrote, "Keep your corn, O Libya! Unyoke your oxen, provided only you send us mushrooms." She went on to set down the technical description from the textbook and a simple rule for distinguishing the varieties, adding, "I don't suppose you will gather any before my return. You would hardly risk such a thing without my superior counsel. But should you do so, keep the rule in mind. It is taken word for word from the book, so if anything happens to you while I am gone, either you or the book will be to blame, not I. When I come back, if I ever do, I mean to try at least a sample of that Epicurean delight, which one old authority called food of the gods, provided I can find any of them growing outside of that gruesome devil's garden." Frank gave no special attention to this portion of her letter. His interest in mushrooms was confined chiefly to the days when Constance could be there to expatiate on them in person. In another letter she referred to their adventure on the mountain, and to the fact that Frank would be likely to see Robin before her return. "You may tell Robin Farnham," she said, "about our visit to the hermit, and of the message he sent. Robin may be going in that direction very soon, and find time to stop there. Of course, you will be careful not to let anything slip about the tale he told us. I am sure it would make no difference, but I know you will agree with me that his wishes should be sacred. Dear me, what a day that was, and how I did love that wonderful house! Here, among all these people, in this big modern hotel, it seems that it must have been all really enchantment. Perhaps you and Robin could make a trip up there together. I know if there truly is a hermit he will be glad to see you again. I wonder if he would like to see me again. I brought up all those sad memories. Poor old man! My sympathy for him is deeper than you can guess." It happened that Robin returned to the lodge that same afternoon. A little later Frank found him in the guide's cabin, and recounted to him his recent adventures with Constance on the mountain, how they had wandered at last to the hermitage, adding the message which their host had sent to Robin himself. The guide listened reflectively, as was his habit. Then he said, "It seems curious that you should have been lost up there, just as I was once, and that you should have drifted to the same place. You took a little different path from mine. I followed the chasm to the end, while you crossed on the 2 logs which the old fellow and I put there afterward to save me time. I usually have to make short visits, because few parties care to stay on McIntyre overnight, and it's only now and then that I can get away at all. I have been thinking about the old chap a good deal lately, but I'm afraid it would mean a special trip just now, and it would be hard to find a day for that." "I will arrange it," said Frank. "In fact, I have already done so. I spoke to Morrison this morning, and engaged you for a day as soon as you got in. I want to make another trip up the mountain myself. We'll go to-morrow morning, directly to the cabin, and I'll see that you have plenty of time for a good visit. What I want most is another look around the place itself and its surroundings. I may want to construct a place like that some day, in imagination at least." So it was arranged that the young men should visit the hermitage together. They set out early next morning, following the McIntyre trail to the point below the little fall where the hermit had bidden good-bye to mankind so many years before. Here they turned aside and ascended the cliff by the hidden path, presently reaching the secluded and isolated spot where the lonely, stricken man had established his domain. As they drew near the curious dwelling, which because of its construction was scarcely noticeable until they were immediately upon it, they spoke in lowered voices, and presently not at all. It seemed to them, too, that there was a hush about the spot which they had not noticed elsewhere. Frank recalled the chorus of birds which had filled the little garden with song, and wondered at their apparent absence now. The sun was bright, the sky above was glorious, the gay posies along the garden paths were as brilliant as before, but so far as he could see and hear, the hermit's small neighbors and companions had vanished. "There is a sort of Sunday quiet about it," whispered Frank. "Perhaps the old fellow is out for a ramble and has taken his friends with him." Then he added, "I'll wait here while you go in. If he's there, stay and have your talk with him while I wander about the place a little. Later, if he doesn't mind, I will come in." Frank directed his steps toward the little garden and let his eyes wander up and down among the beds which the hermit had planted. It was late summer now, and many of the things were already ripening. In a little more the blackening frost would come and the heavy snow drift in. What a strange life it had been there, winter and summer, with only nature and a pageantry of dreams for companionship. There must have been days when, like the Lady of Shalott, he had cried out, "I am sick of shadows," and it may have been on such days that he had watched by the trail to hear and perhaps to see real men and women. And when the helplessness of very old age should come, what then? Within his mind, Frank had a half-formed plan to persuade the hermit to return to the companionship of men. There were many retreats now in these hills, places where every comfort and the highest medical skill could be obtained for patients such as he. Frank had conceived the idea of providing for the hermit's final days in some such home, and he had partly confided his plan to Robin as they had followed the trail together. Robin, if anybody, could win the old fellow to the idea. There came the sound of a step on the path behind. The young man, turning, faced Robin. There was something in the latter's countenance that caused Frank to regard him searchingly. "He is not there, then?" "No, he is not there." "He will be back soon, of course." But Robin shook his head, and said with gentle gravity, "No, he will not be back. He has journeyed to a far country." Together they passed under the low eaves and entered the curious dwelling. Light came through the open door and the parchment-covered window. In the high-backed chair before the hearth the hermit sat, his chin dropped forward on his breast. His years of exile were ended. All the heart-yearning and loneliness had slipped away. He had become one with the shadows among which he had dwelt so long. Nor was there any other life in the room. As the birds outside had vanished, so the flitting squirrels had departed, who shall say whither? Yet the change had come but recently, perhaps on that very morning, for though the fire had dropped to ashes on the hearth, a tiny wraith of smoke still lingered and drifted waveringly up the chimney. The intruders moved softly about the room without speaking. Presently Frank beckoned to Robin, and pointed to something lying on the table. It was a birch-bark envelope, and in a dark ink, doubtless made from some root or berry, was addressed to Robin. The guide opened it, and taking it to the door, read: "My dear boy Robin, I have felt of late that my time is very near. It is likely that I shall see you no more in this world. It is my desire, therefore, to set down my wishes here while I yet have the strength. They are but few, for a life like mine leaves not many desires behind it. It is my wish that such of my belongings as you care to preserve should be yours. They are of little value, but perhaps the field glass and the books may in future years recall the story in which they have been a part. In a little chest you will find some other trifles, a picture or two, some papers that were once valuable to those living in the world of men, some old letters. All that is there, all that is mine, and all the affection that lingers in my heart, are yours. Yet I must not forget the little girl who was once your sister. If it chance that you meet her again, and if when she knows my story she will care for any memento of this lonely life, you may place some trifle in her hands. It was my story that I had chiefly meant to set down for you, for it is nearer to your own than you suppose. But now, only a few days since, out of my heart I gave it to those who were here, and who, perhaps, ere this, have given you my message to come. A young man and a woman they were, and their happiness together led me to speak of old days and of a happiness that was mine. The girl's face stirred me strangely, and I spoke to her fully, as I have long wished, yet feared, to speak to you. You will show her this letter, and she will repeat to you all the tale which I no longer have strength to write. Then you will understand why I have been drawn to you so strangely, why I have called you my dear boy, why I would that I might call you son. There is no more. Only, when you shall find me here asleep, make me a bed in the corner of my garden, where the hollyhocks come each year, and the squirrels frisk overhead, and the birds sing. Lay me not too deeply away from it all, and cover me only with boughs and the cool gratifying earth which shall soothe away the fever. And bring no stone to mark the place, but only breathe a little word of prayer and leave me in the comfortable dark." Neither Robin nor Frank spoke for a time after the reading of the letter. Then faithfully, and with a few words, they carried out the hermit's wishes. Tenderly and gently they bore him to the narrow resting place which they prepared for him, and when the task was finished, they stood above the spot for a little space with bowed heads. After this they returned to the cabin, and gathered up such articles of Robin's inheritance as they would be able to carry down the mountain: the books and field glass, which had been so much to him, the gun above the mantel, a trout rod, and a package of articles from the little chest which they had brought to the door and opened. At the top of the package was a small, cheap ferrotype picture, such as young people are wont to have made at the traveling photographer's. It was of a sweet-faced, merry-lipped girl, and Robin scanned it long and thoughtfully. "That is such a face as my mother had when young," he said at last. Then turning to Frank, "Did he know my mother? Is that the story?" Frank bent his head in assent. "That is the story," he said, "but it is long. Besides, it is his wish, I am sure, that another should tell it to you." He had taken from the chest some folded, official-looking papers as he spoke, and glanced at them now, first hastily, then with growing interest. They were a quantity of registered bonds, the hermit's fortune, which in a few brief days had become, as he said, but a mockery of scrolled engraving and gaudy seals. Frank had only a slight knowledge of such matters, yet he wondered if by any possibility these old securities of a shipwrecked company might be of value today. The corporation title, he thought, had a familiar sound. A vague impression grew upon him that this company had been one of the few to be rehabilitated with time, that in some measure at least it had made good its obligations. "Suppose you let me take these," he suggested to Robin. "They may not be wholly worthless. At least it will do no harm to send them to my solicitor." Robin nodded. He was still regarding the little tintype, and the sweet young face of the mother who had died so long ago. Chapter 11. Chapter 12 of The Lucky Piece, A Tale of the North Woods, by Albert Bigelow Paine. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. Constance returns and hears a story. "I only told him," Frank wrote that night to Constance, "that the hermit's story had a part in his mother's life. I suppose I might have told him more, but he seemed quite willing to wait and hear it from you, as suggested by the hermit's letter, and I was only too willing that he should do so. Knowing Robin, as you have, from childhood, and the sorrow of his early days and all, you are much better fitted to tell the story, and you will tell it much better than I. Robin is to leave again tomorrow on a trip over Tuhas, I mean, for I hate these modern names, but will be back by the end of the week, by which time I hope you also will once more make glad these lonesome forest glades. Seriously, Connie, I long for you much more than perhaps you realize, or, I am sure, would permit me to say. And I don't mean to write a love letter now. In the first place, I would not disobey orders to that degree, and even if I did, I know that you would say that it was only because poor old Robin Gray's story and his death and all, and perhaps wandering about in these woods alone, had made me a bit sentimental. Well, who knows just whence and how emotions come? Perhaps you would be right, But if I should tell you that during the 2 weeks which have nearly slipped by since that day when we found our way through the mist to the hermit's cabin, my whole point of view has somehow changed, and that, whatever the reasons, I see with different eyes, with a new heart and with an uplifted spirit, perhaps I should be right too. And if from such a consecration my soul should speak and say, 'Dear my heart, I love you, and I will always love you all my days,' it may be that you would believe and understand." Whether it was this letter or the news it contained, or whether Mrs. Deane's improved condition warranted, from whatever reason, Constance and her mother 2 days later returned to the camp on the Au Sable. They were given a genuine ovation as they passed the lodge, at which point Mr. Deane joined them. Frank found his heart in a very disturbing condition indeed as he looked once more into Miss Deane's eyes and took her hand in welcome. Later in the day he deemed it necessary to take a walk in the direction of the camp to see if he could be of any assistance in making the new arrivals comfortable. It was a matter of course that he should remain for dinner, and whatever change may have taken place in him, he certainly appeared on this occasion much like the old light-hearted youth, with little thought beyond the joy of the event and the jest of the moment. But that night, when he parted from Constance to take the dark trail home, he did not find it easy to go, nor yet to make an excuse for lingering. The mantle of gaiety had somehow slipped away, and as they stood there in the fragrance of the firs, with the sound of falling water coming through the trees, the words he had meant to utter did not come. He spoke at last of their day together on the mountain and of their visit to the hermit's cabin. To both of them it seemed something of a very long time ago. Then Frank recounted in detail all that had happened that quiet morning when he and Robin had visited the place, and spoke of the letter and last wishes of the dead man. "You are sure you do not mind letting me tell Robin the story?" she said. "Alone, I mean. I should like to do so, and I think he would prefer it." Frank looked at her through the dusk. "I want you to do it that way," he said earnestly. "I told you so in my letter. I have a feeling that any third person would be an intruder at such a time. It seems to me that you are the only one to tell him." "Yes," she agreed, after a pause. "I am. I knew Robin's mother. I was a little girl, but I remember. Oh, you will understand it all some day." Frank may have wondered vaguely why she put it that way, but he made no comment. His hand found hers in the dusk, and he held it for a moment at parting. "That is dark way I am going," he said, looking down the trail. "But I shall not even remember the darkness now that you are here again." Constance laughed softly. "Perhaps it is my halo that makes the difference." A moment later he had turned to go, but paused to say, casually it seemed, "By the way, I have a story to read to you, a manuscript. It was written by some one I know, who had a copy mailed to me. It came this morning. I am sure the author, whose name is to be withheld for the present, would appreciate your opinion." "And my judgment is to be final, of course? Very well. Minerva holds her court at 10 to-morrow at the top of yon small mountain, which on one side slopes to the lake, and on the other overlooks the pleasant Valley of Decision, which borders the West Branch." "And do I meet Minerva on the mountain top, or do I call for her at the usual address, that is to say, here?" "You may call for Minerva. After her recent period of inactivity she may need assistance over the hard places." Frank did, in fact, arrive at the camp next morning almost in time for breakfast. Perhaps the habit of early rising had grown upon him of late. Perhaps he only wished to assure himself that Constance had really returned. Even a wish to hear her opinion of the manuscript may have exerted a certain influence. They set out presently, followed by numerous injunctions from Mrs. Deane concerning fogs and trails and an early return. Frank had never ascended this steep little mountain back of the camp, save once by a trail that started from near the Lodge. He let Constance take the lead. It was a rare morning, one of the first September days, when the early blaze of autumn begins to kindle along the hills, when there is just a spice of frost in the air, when the air and sunlight combine in a tonic that lifts the heart, the soul, almost the body itself, from the material earth. "If you are Minerva, then I am Mercury," Frank declared as they ascended the first rise. "I feel that my feet have wings." Then suddenly he paused, for they had come to a little enclosure where the bushes had been but recently cleared away. There was a gate, and within a small grave, evidently that of a child. Also a headstone upon which was cut the single word, "Constance." Frank started a little as he read the name, and regarded it wonderingly, without speaking. Then he turned to his companion with inquiry in his face. "That was the first little Constance," she said. "I took her place and name. She always loved this spot, so when she died they laid her here. They expected to come back sooner. Her mother wanted just the name on the stone." Frank had a strange feeling as he regarded the little grave. "I never knew that you had lost a sister," he said. "I mean that your parents had buried a little girl. Of course, she died before you were born." "No," she said, "but her death was a fearful blow. Mamma can hardly speak of it even to-day. She could never confess that her little girl was dead, so they called me by her name. I cannot explain it all now." Frank said musingly, "I remember your saying once that you were not even what you seemed to be. Is this what you meant?" She nodded. "Yes, that is what I meant." They pushed on up the hill, without many words. The little enclosure and the graven stone had made them thoughtful. Arriving at the peak they found, at the brow of a cliff, a broad shelving stone which hung out over a deep wooded hollow, where here and there the red and gold were beginning to gleam. From it they could look across toward Algonquin, where they tried to locate the spot of the hermit's cabin, and down upon the lake and the Lodge, which seemed to lie almost at their feet. At first they merely rested and drank in the glory of the view. Then at last Frank drew from his pocket a folded typewritten paper. "If the court of Minerva is convened, I will lay this matter before her," he said. It was not a story of startling theme that he read to her, the victory of defeat. It was only a tale of a man's love, devotion, and sacrifice, but it was told so simply, with so little attempt to make it seem a story, that one listening forgot that it was not indeed a true relation, that the people were not living and loving and suffering toward a surrender which rose to triumph with the final page. Once only Constance interrupted to say, "Your friend is fortunate to have so good a reader to interpret his story. I did not know you had that quality in your voice." He did not reply, and when he had finished reading and laid the manuscript down he waited for her comment. It was rather unexpected. "You must be very fond of the one who wrote that," she said. He looked at her quickly, hardly sure of her meaning. Then he smiled. "I am. Almost too much so, perhaps." "But why? I think I could love the man who did that story." An expression half quizzical, half gratified flitted across Frank's features. "And if it were written by a woman?" he said. Constance did not reply, and the tender look in her face grew a little cold. A tiny bit of something which she did not recognize suddenly germinated in her heart. It was hardly envy. She would have scorned to call it jealousy. She rose, rather hastily, it seemed. "Which perhaps accounts for your having read it so well," she said. "I did not realize, and I suppose such a story might be written by almost any woman except myself." Frank caught up the manuscript and poised it like a missile. "Another word and it goes over the cliff," he threatened. She caught back his arm, laughing naturally enough. "It is ourselves that must be going over the cliff," she declared. "I am sure Mamma is worrying about us already." End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of The Lucky Piece, A Tale of the North Woods, by Albert Bigelow Paine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. What the Small Woman in Black Saw. With September, the hurry at the Lodge subsided. Vacations were beginning to be over. Mountain climbers and wood rangers were returning to office, studio, and classroom. Those who remained were chiefly men and women bound to no regular occupations, caring more for the woods when the crowds of summer had departed and the red and gold of autumn were marching down the mountainside. It had been a busy season at the Lodge, and Edith Morrison's face told the tale. The constant responsibility, and the effort to maintain the standard of entertainment, had left a worn look in her eyes and taken the color from her cheeks. The burden had lain chiefly on her young shoulders. Her father was invaluable as an entertainer and had a fund of information, but he was without practical resources, and the strain upon Edith had told. If for another reason a cloud had settled on her brow and a shadow had gathered in her heart, she had uttered no word, but had gone on, day by day, early and late, devising means and supervising methods, doing whatever was necessary to the management of a big household through all those busy weeks. Little more than the others had she seen Robin during those last August days. He had been absent almost constantly. When he returned it was usually late, and such was the demand upon this most popular of Adirondack guides that in nearly every case he found a party waiting for early departure. If Edith suspected that there were times when he might have returned sooner, when she believed that he had paused at the camp on the west branch of the Au Sable, she still spoke no word and made no definite outward sign. Whatever she brooded in her heart was in that secret and silence which may have come down to her, with those black eyes and that glossy hair, from some old ancestor who silently, in his wigwam, pointed his arrows and cuddled his resentment to keep it warm. It had happened that during the days when Constance had been absent with her mother, Robin had twice returned at an earlier hour, and this could hardly fail to strengthen any suspicion that might already exist of his fidelity, especially as the little woman in black had commented on the matter in Edith's presence, as well as upon the fact that immediately after the return of the absent ones he failed to reach the Lodge by daylight. It is a fact well established that once we begin to look for heartache we always find it, and, as well, someone to aid us in the search. Not that Edith had made a confidante of the sinister-clad little woman. On the whole, she disliked her and was much more drawn toward the good-natured but garrulous old optimist, Miss Carroway, who saw with clear, undistorted vision and never failed to say a word, a great many words, in fact, that carried comfort because they constituted a plea for the creed of general happiness and the scheme of universal good. Had Edith sought a confidant merely for the sake of easing her heart, it is likely that it was to this good old spinster that she would have turned. But a nature such as hers does not confide its soul hurt merely for the sake of consolation. In the beginning, when she had hinted something of it to Robin, he had laughed her fears away. Then, a little later, she had spoken to Frank Weatherby, for his sake as well as for her own. He had not laughed, but had listened and reflected, for the time at least. And his manner and his manhood, and that which she considered a bond of sympathy between them, made him the one to whom she must turn, now when the time had come to speak again. There came a day when Robin did not go to the woods. In the morning he had been about the lodge and the guide's cabin, of which he was now the sole occupant, greeting Edith in his old manner and suggesting a walk later in the day. But the girl pleaded a number of household duties, and presently Robin disappeared to return no more until late in the afternoon. When he did appear, he seemed abstracted and grave, and went to the cabin to prepare for a trip next morning. Frank Weatherby, who had been putting in most of the day over some papers in his room, now returning from a run up the hillside to a point where he could watch the sunset, paused to look in passing. "Miss Deane has been telling me the hermit story," Robin said as he saw who it was. "It seems to me one of the saddest stories I ever heard. My regret is that he did not tell it to me himself, years ago. Poor old fellow! As if I would have let it make any difference." "But he could not be sure," said Frank. "You were all in the world to him, and he could not afford to take the chance of losing you." "And to think that all those years he lived up there, watching our struggle. And what a hard struggle it was. Poor mother! I wish she might have known he was there." Neither spoke for a time. Then they reviewed their visit to the hermitage together, when they had performed the last sad offices for its lonely occupant. Next morning Robin was away with his party, and Frank wandered over to the camp, but found no one there besides the servants. He surmised that Constance and her parents had gone to visit the little grave on the hillside, and followed in that direction, thinking to meet them. He was nearing the spot when, at a turn in the path, he saw them. He was unobserved, and he saw that Constance had her arms about Mrs. Deane, who was weeping. He withdrew silently and walked slowly back to the lodge, where he spent the rest of the morning over a writing table in his room, while on the veranda the circle of industry, still active though much reduced as to numbers, discussed the fact that of late Mr. Weatherby was seen oftener at the lodge, while, on the other hand, Constance had scarcely been seen there since her return. The little woman in black shook her head ominously, and hinted that she might tell a good deal if she would, an attitude which Miss Carroway promptly resented, declaring that she had thus far never known her to keep back anything that was worth telling. It was during the afternoon that Frank, loitering through a little grove of birches near the boat landing, came face to face with Edith Morrison. He saw in an instant that she had something to say to him. She was as white as the birches about her, while in her eyes there was the bright, burning look he had seen there once before, now more fierce and intensified. She paused by a mossy-covered boulder called the Stone Seat, and rested her hand upon it. Frank saw that she was trembling violently. He started to speak, but she forestalled him. "I have something to tell you," she began, with hurried eagerness. "I spoke of it once before, when I only suspected. Now I know. I don't think you believed me then, and I doubted, sometimes, myself. But I do not doubt any longer. We have been fools all along, you and I. They have never cared for us since she came, but only for each other. And instead of telling us, as brave people would, they have let us go on, blinding us so they could blind others, or perhaps thinking we do not matter enough for them to care. Oh, you are kind and good and willing to believe in them, but they shall not deceive you any longer. I know the truth, and I mean that you shall know it too." Out of the varying emotions with which the young man listened to the rapid torrent of words, there came the conviction that without doubt the girl, to have been stirred so deeply, must have seen or heard something which she regarded as definite. He believed that she was mistaken, but it was necessary that he should hear her, in order, if possible, to convince her of her error. He motioned her into the seat formed by the boulder, for she seemed weak from overexcitement. Leaning against it, he looked down into her dark, striking face, startled to see how worn and frail she seemed. "Miss Morrison," he began gently, "you are overwrought. You have had a hard summer, with many cares. Perhaps you have not been able to see quite clearly. Perhaps things are not as you suppose. Perhaps—" She interrupted him. "Oh," she said, "I do not suppose. I know. I have known all the time. I have seen it in 100 ways, only they were always ways that one cannot put into words. But now something has happened that anybody can see, and that can be told. Something has been seen and told." She looked up at Frank, those deep burning eyes of hers full of indignation. He said, "Tell me just what you mean. What has happened, and who has seen it?" "It was yesterday, in the woods. The woods between here and the camp on the Au Sable. They were sitting as we are, and he held her hand, and she had been crying. And when they parted, he said to her, 'We must tell them. You must get Mrs. Deane's consent. I am sure Edith suspects something, and it isn't right to go on like this. We must tell them.' Then he kissed her. That, of course—" The girl's voice broke, and she could not continue. Frank waited a moment. Then he said, "And who witnessed this scene?" "Mrs. Kitcher." "You mean the little woman who dresses in black?" "Yes, that is the one." "And you would believe that tale-bearing eavesdropper?" "I must. I have seen so much myself." "Then let me say this. I believe that most of what she told you is false. She may have seen them together. She may have seen him take her hand. I know that Miss Deane told Robin something yesterday that related to his past life, and that it was a sad tale. It might easily bring the tears, and she would give him her hand as an old friend. There may have been something said about his telling you, for there is no reason why you should not know the story. It is merely of an old man who is dead, and who knew Robin's mother. So far as anything further, I believe that woman invented it purely to make mischief. One who will spy and listen will do more. I would not believe her on oath, nor must you either." But Edith still shook her head. "Oh, you don't know," she persisted. "There has been much besides. It is all a part of the rest. You have not a woman's intuition, and Robin has not a woman's skill in deceiving. There is something, I know there is something, I have seen it all along. And oh, what should Robin keep from me?" "Have you spoken to him of it?" "Once, about the time you came. He laughed at me. I would hardly mention it again." "Yet it seems to me that would be the thing to do," Frank reflected aloud. "At least, you can ask him about the story told him by Miss Deane. You may say I mentioned it." Edith regarded him in amaze. "And you think I could do that? That I could ask him of anything that he did not tell me of his own accord? Will you ask Miss Deane about that meeting in the woods?" Frank shook his head. "I do not need to do so. I know about it." She looked at him quickly, puzzled for the moment as to his meaning, wondering if he, too, might be a part of a conspiracy against her happiness. Then she said, comprehending, "No, you only believe. I have not your credulity and faith. I see things as they are, and it is not right that you should be blinded any longer. I had to tell you." She rose with quick suddenness as if to go. "Wait," he said. "I am glad you told me. I believe everything is all right, whatever that woman saw. I believe she saw very little, and until you have seen and learned for yourself, you must believe that, too. Somehow, everything always comes out right. It must, you know, or the world is a failure. And this will come out right. Robin will tell you the story when he comes back and explain everything. I am sure of it. Don't let it trouble you for a single moment." He put out his hand instinctively, and she took it. Her eyes were full of hot tears. It came upon Frank in that instant that if Miss Kitcher were watching now she would probably see as much to arouse suspicion as she had seen the day before, and he said so without hesitation. Edith made a futile effort to reflect his smile. "Yes," she agreed. "But, oh, that was different. There was more, and there has been so much, all along." She left him then, followed by a parting word of reassurance. When she had disappeared, he dropped back on the stone seat and sat looking through the trees toward the little boat landing, revolving in his mind the scene just ended. From time to time he applied unpleasant names to the small woman in black, whose real name had proved to be Kitcher. What, after all, had she really seen and heard? He believed very little. Certainly not so much as she had told. But then, one by one, certain trifling incidents came back to him. A word here, a look there, the tender speaking of a name, even certain inflections and scarcely perceptible movements. The things which, as Edith had said, one cannot put into words. Reviewing the matter carefully, he became less certain in his faith. Perhaps, after all, Edith was right. Perhaps there was something between those two, and troubling thoughts took the joy out of the sunlight and the brightness from the dancing waters. The afternoon was already far gone, and during the rest of the day he sat in the little grove of birches above the landing, smoking and revolving many matters in his mind. For a time the unhappiness of Edith Morrison was his chief thought, and he resolved to go immediately to Constance and lay the circumstances fully before her, that she might clear up the misunderstanding and restore general happiness and good will. Twice, indeed, he rose to set out for the camp, but each time returned to the stone seat. What if it were really true that a great love had sprung up between Constance and Robin, a love which was at once a glory and a tragedy, such a love as had brightened and blotted the pages of history since the gods began their sports with humankind and joined them in battle on the plains of Troy? What if it were true, after all? If it were true, then Constance and Robin would reveal it soon enough, of their own accord. If it were not true, then Edith Morrison's wild jealousy would seem absurd to Constance, and to Robin, who would be obliged to know. Frank argued that he had no right to risk for her such humiliation as would result to one of her temperament for having given way to groundless jealousy. These were the reasons he gave himself for not going with the matter to Constance. But the real reason was that he did not have the courage to approach her on the subject. For one thing, he would not know how to begin. For another, and this, after all, comprised everything, he was afraid it might be true. So he lingered there on the stone seat, while the September afternoon faded, the sun slipped down the west, and long, cool mountain shadows gathered in the little grove. If it were true, there was no use of further endeavor. It was for Constance, more than for any other soul, living or dead, that he had renewed his purpose in life, that he had recalled old ambitions, reestablished old effort. Without Constance, what was the use? Nobody would care, he least of all. If it were true, the few weeks of real life that had passed since that day with her on the mountain, when they had been lost in the mist and found the hermitage together, would remain through the years to come a memory somewhat like that which the hermit had carried with him into the wilderness. Like Robin Gray, he too would become a hermit, though in that greater wilderness, the world of men. Yet he could be more than Robin Gray, for with means he could lend a hand. And then he remembered that such help would not be needed, and the thought made the picture in his mind seem more desolate, more hopeless. But suddenly, from somewhere, out of the clear sky of a subconscious mind perhaps, a thought, a resolve clothed in words, fell upon his lips. "If it is true, and if I can win her love, I will marry Edith Morrison," he said. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of The Lucky Piece, A Tale of the North Woods, by Albert Bigelow Paine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. What Miss Carroway Did. The circle of industry had been minus an important member that afternoon. The small woman in black was there, and a reduced contingent of such auxiliary members as still remained in the wilds, but the chief director and center of affairs, Miss Carroway, was absent. She had set out immediately after luncheon, and Mrs. Kitcher had for once enjoyed the privilege of sowing discord, shedding gloom and retailing dark hints, unopposed and undismayed. Her opponent, for the time at least, had abandoned the field. Miss Carroway had set out quietly enough, taking the path around the lake that on the other side joined the trail which led to the Deane camp. It was a rare afternoon, and the old lady, carefully dressed, primly curled, and with a bit of knitting in her hand, sauntered leisurely through the sunlit woods toward the West Branch. She was a peaceful note in the picture as she passed among the tall spruces, or paused for a moment amid a little grove of maples that were turning red and gold, some of the leaves drifting to her feet. Perhaps she reflected that for them, as for her, the summer time was over, that their day of usefulness was nearly ended. Perhaps she recalled the day not long ago when the leaves had been fresh and fair with youth, and it may be that the thought brought back her own youth, when she had been a girl, climbing the hills back of Haverford, when there had been young men who had thought her as fresh and fair, and one who, because of a misunderstanding, had gone away to war without a good-bye, and had died at Wilson's Creek with a bullet through her picture on his heart. As she lingered here and there in the light of these pleasant places, it would have been an easy task to reconstruct in that placid, faded face the beauty of 40 years ago, to see in her again the strong, handsome girl who had put aside her own heritage of youth and motherhood to carry the burdens of an invalid sister, to adopt finally as her own the last feeble, motherless infant, to devote her years and strength to him, to guide him step by step to a place of honor among his fellow men. Seeing her now, and knowing these things, it was not hard to accord her a former beauty. It was not difficult even to declare her beautiful still, for something of it all had come back, something of the old romance, of awakened purpose and the tender interest of love. Where the trail crossed the Au Sable Falls, she paused and surveyed the place with approval. "That would be a nice place for a weddin'," she reflected aloud. "Charlie used to say a piece at school about the groves was God's first temples, and this makes me think of it." Then she forgot her reflections, for a little way beyond the falls, assorting something from a basket, was the object of her visit, Constance Deane. She had spread some specimens on the grass and was comparing them with the pictures in the book beside her. As Miss Carroway approached, she greeted her cordially. "Welcome to our camp," she said. "I have often wondered why you never came over this way. My parents will be so glad to see you. You must come right up to the house and have a cup of tea." But Miss Carroway seated herself on the grass beside Constance instead. "I came over to see you," she said quietly. "Just you alone. I had tea before I started. I want to talk about one or two things a little, and maybe give you some advice." Constance smiled and looked down at the mushrooms on the grass. "About those, you mean," she said. "Well, I suppose I need it. I find I know less than I thought I did in the beginning." Miss Carroway shook her head. "No," she admitted. "I've give up that question. I guess the books know more than I do. You ain't dead yet, and if they was poison you would 'a' been by this time. It's somethin' else I want to talk about, somethin' that's made a good many people unhappy, includin' me. That was a long time ago, but I suppose I ain't quite got over it yet." A good deal of the September afternoon slipped away as the two women talked there in the sunshine by the Au Sable Falls. When at last Miss Carroway rose to go, Constance rose too, and taking her hand, kissed the old lady on the cheek. "You are sweet and good," she said, "and I wish I could do as much for you as you have done, and are willing to do, for me. If I have not confided in you, it is only because I cannot, today. But I shall tell you all that there is to tell as soon, almost as soon, as I tell any one. It may be tomorrow, and I promise you that there shall be no unhappiness that I can help." "Things never can be set straight too soon," said the old lady. "I've had a long time to think of that." Miss Deane's eyes grew moist. "Oh, I thank you for telling me your story," she said. "It is beautiful, and you have lived a noble life." The shadows had grown deeper in the woods as Miss Carroway followed a path back to the lake and so around to the Lodge. The sun had vanished from the tree tops, and some of the light and reflex of youth had faded from the old lady's face. Perhaps she was a little weary with her walk, and it may be a little disappointed at what she had heard, or rather what she had not heard, in her talk with Constance Deane. At the end of the lake she followed the path through the little birch grove and came upon Frank Weatherby, where he mused on the stone seat. Miss Carroway paused as he rose and greeted her. "I just come from a good walk," she said peacefully. "I've been over to the Deanes' camp. It's a pretty place." Frank nodded. "I suppose you saw the family?" he said. "No. Only Miss Deane. She was studyin' toadstools, but I guess they wasn't p'ison. I guess she knows 'em." Frank made no comment on this remark, and the old lady looked out on the lake a moment, and added, as one reflecting aloud on a matter quite apart from the subject in hand, "If I was a young man, and had anything on my mind, I'd go to the one it was about and get it off as quick as I could." Then she started on up the path, Frank stepping aside to let her pass. As he did so, he lifted his hat and said, "I think that is good advice, Miss Carroway, and I thank you for it." But he dropped back on the seat when she was gone and sat staring out on the water, that caught and gave back the colors of the fading sky. Certainly it was good advice, and he would act on it, tomorrow perhaps, not today. Then he smiled rather quaintly. "I wonder who will be next on the scene," he thought. "First the injured girl, then the good old busybody, whose mission it is to help things along. It would seem about time for the chief characters to appear." Once the sun is gone, twilight gathers quickly in the hills. The color blended out of the woods, the mountains around the lake faded into walls of tone, a tide of dusk crept out of the deeper forest and enclosed the birches. Only the highest mountain peaks, Algonquin and Tahawus, caught the gold and amethyst of day's final tokens of good-bye. Then that faded, and only the sky told the story to the lake, that repeated it in its heart. From among the shadows on the farther side a boat drifted into the evening light. It came noiselessly. Frank's eye did not catch it until it neared the center of the lake. Then presently he recognized the silhouetted figures, holding his breath a little as he watched them to make sure. Evidently Robin had returned with his party and stopped by the Deane camp. Frank's anticipation was to be realized. The chief characters in the drama were about to appear. Propelled by Robin's strong arms, the Adirondack canoe shot quickly to the little dock. A moment later the guide took a basket handed to him and assisted his two passengers, Constance and Mrs. Deane, to land. As they stood on the dock they were in the half-dusk, yet clearly outlined against the pale green water behind. Frank wondered what had brought Mrs. Deane to the lodge. Probably the walk and row through the perfect evening. The little group was but a few yards distant, but it never occurred to Frank that he could become an eavesdropper. The presence of Mrs. Deane would have dispelled any such idea, even had it presented itself. He watched them without curiosity, deciding that when they passed the grove of birches he would step out and greet them. For the moment, at least, most of his recent doubts were put aside. But all at once he saw Constance turn to her mother and take her hands. "You are sure you are willing that we should make it known tonight?" she said. And quite distinctly on that still air came the answer. "Yes, dear. I have kept you and Robin waiting long enough. After all, Robin is more to you than I am." And the elder woman held out her hand to Robin Farnham, who, taking it, drew closer to the two, Then the girl's arms were about her mother's neck, but a moment later she had turned to Robin. "After tonight we belong to each other," she said. "How it will surprise everybody!" And she kissed him fairly on the lips. It all happened so quickly, so unexpectedly, they had been so near, that Frank could hardly have chosen other than to see and hear. He sat as one stupefied while they ascended the path, passing within a few feet of the stone seat. He was overcome by the suddenness of the revelation, even though the fact had been the possibility in his afternoon's brooding. Also, he was overwhelmed with shame and mortification that he should have heard and seen that which had been intended for no ears and eyes but their own. How fiercely he had condemned Mrs. Kitcher, who it would seem had been truthful after all, and doubtless even less culpable in her eavesdropping. He told himself that he should have turned away upon the first words spoken by Constance to her mother. Then he might not have heard and seen until the moment when they had intended that the revelation should be made. That was why Mrs. Deane had come, to give dignity and an official air to the news. He wondered if he and Edith were to be told privately, or if the banns were to be announced to a gathered company, as in the old days when they were published to church congregations. And Edith, what would it mean to her? What would she do? Oh, there was something horrible about it all, something impossible, something that the brain refused to understand. He did not see or hear the figure that silently as an Indian, from the other side of the grove stole up the incline toward the lodge, avoiding the group, making its way to the rear by another path. He only sat there, stunned and hopeless, in the shadows. The night air became chill, and he was growing numb and stiff from sitting in one position. Still he did not move. He was trying to think. He would not go to the lodge. He would not be a spectacle. He would not look upon or listen to their happiness. He would go away at once, tonight. He would leave everything behind, and following the road to Lake Placid, would catch an early train. Then he remembered that he had said he would marry Edith Morrison if he could win her love. But the idea had suddenly grown impossible. Edith would be crushed in the dust, killed. No, oh no, that was impossible. That could not happen. Not now. Not yet. He recalled, too, what he had resolved concerning a life apart, such a life as the hermit had led among the hills, and he thought his own lot the more bitter, for at least the hermit's love had been returned, and it was only fate that had come between. Yet he would be as generous. They would not need his help, but through the years he would wish them well. Yes, he could do that. And he would watch from a distance and guard their welfare if ever time of need should come. Long through the dark he sat there, unheeding the time, caring nothing that the sky had become no longer pale, but a deep, dusky blue, while the lake carried the stars in its bosom. End of chapter 14.